Anyway, I would like to welcome you all to this session. I know it's been a long couple of days for folks, and really, I'm just super flattered that people did show up to the last optional session of the day. So thanks. You're really making me feel better about this. So I want to talk with y'all about a very fresh ship from GitHub called GitHub Actions. We just released this about a week ago. We've been keeping it pretty tight-lipped up until that time. And just to give you a quick little background for me and why I'm speaking to y'all, I'm from Atlanta. My name's Greg Padak. I work with GitHub and have been doing so for about 4 years, a little over 4 years. And in my role, I sit in between the sales, support, and technology organizations, and I oversee our customer feedback program primarily. So a little bit of customer conversation, a lot of customer feedback, prioritization, try to figure out what y'all want and need, and how we figure out how the product team can take that and roll with it. So one part, figuring out issues that y'all are dealing with, and then the other part is, hey, we're building this really cool thing called GitHub Actions. What do you think about it, right? So there's a little bit of everything going on there. And to kind of set the stage here for what I want to talk about, we live in a tools-rich economy right now. There's a tool for everything, but really what we need is to have better conversations around what tools we're using and why. And there's a really good reasoning for this. In Gene's day one keynote, we brought this IDC slide up here to talk about how many developers there are. 21 million developers, 18 million people in supporting roles, and then over half of those developers are doing so for a living. So they're paying their mortgages with the paychecks that they get from this job. And it's very important that we set up a good environment for folks that are working in this industry. From a GitHub perspective, we also released the State of the Octoverse for 2018. And in that report, we have the numbers a little bit different, but I think we're all kind of talking about the same thing. In here, we're talking about 31 million plus developers and a ton of organizations and projects on GitHub. And then really the most interesting one for us is the pull request number down at the bottom, which is really about collaboration between all these folks. So the highlights I pulled out from that is that there's steady growth in both organizations and projects on GitHub. Most of the pull requests have come in the last year. I mean, over 33% of all pull requests on GitHub just from last year alone. And then the nice thing about this is as we talk to people in universities, as we talk to folks in workshops and boot camps, and we're pulling in new developers that haven't necessarily written any code prior to this point in their careers, or they're coming from other careers, or they're just getting started in the industry. We have more new developers joining GitHub in the last year than the first 6 years of our 10-year history. So developer tooling, or people who are interested in development and developer tooling are growing at an astonishing rate, and so is their activity and their willingness to collaborate. And then, of course, we have this, which, how many people have seen this slide before? It's pretty popular at conferences like this. So there are a lot of tools that fit somewhat neatly into these boxes. I think GitHub is unfairly listed as an SCM, and then we don't show up anywhere else. I don't see collaboration tooling up there, which is another thing that I think is missing. I don't see Slack, right? A lot of people use Slack nowadays. So the people that use them don't necessarily fit in these boxes. And so if there's a container runtime thing in there, I think when we talk a little bit about actions, you'll see that we might fit there as well. But if this is our world, we need a map to it. And really, more fairly, if this is our ecosystem, we need better ways to connect it. And for developers, they often see where their code lives as being at the heart of this ecosystem and the tools that they depend on. For the case of 31 million developers, that place is GitHub. And if you're looking to connect this massive ecosystem in a way that's accessible to more people than ever before, then you need to look no further than our most recent ship, GitHub Actions. So one week ago, 8 days ago, to be fair, at GitHub Universe, we announced this ship. And really, what we're talking about now is more of an era of serverless DevOps. And how's it going so far? GitHub Actions had 32,000 beta signups in the first 24 hours, which is just OK, we were thinking of adding a few hundred people in week 1, so it was a bit overwhelming, I think, with the response. And really, the folks in our community have only had excellent things to say about it as well. Very positive messaging so far. And then there's also a lot of the press around it. People are calling this a game changer and a best practice already, and I wrote like one action so far. So I think we've got some work to do to really prove this out, to tell the same story with the actions that we build relative to what's in the press so far. I think everybody's very impressed with what we have going, and this beta is really going to prove it out. So what are or is GitHub Actions? Primarily, a serverless runtime environment on GitHub's infrastructure. So on github.com, we're going to be able to run actions for you. Every single GitHub action is a Docker container. The workflows that you assemble inside of the workflows that you assemble inside of a repository that contain these GitHub actions can have conditional relationships. There are 26 different webhook events that can trigger an action. And then there's also a new thing that we've done called the repository dispatch event, which allows third-party systems to tell GitHub to take action. So what's the sweet spot for this? The key here is accessibility. Customers ask me and some of my colleagues, GitHub users, they ask us all the time for how they can build their specific custom workflow or what they're thinking about, but only to have it be driven by GitHub data and events. And historically, we've prioritized the platform and APIs for those cases, and we've told these folks that all of these things are possible if you just work with our API, do a little work on your own side, and maybe host it somewhere that you've got, like maybe a Node app or something like that. And then you're going to be able to take action with all this on your own. And then we also went so far as building GitHub apps, which does allow you to have that sort of one-off piece of software property where you can do a lot of this work. You can reach out to our API, do some work with it, maybe display something that, like how are my roles and permissions configured, like some very larger work there. And what we really realized we needed is something that sat in between those two solutions. Like you can't just hit a URL with your API token and get some interesting information and be like, oh, OK, I get it now. And not everybody can learn the JavaScript necessary or anything like that to build a GitHub app. So we need something in the middle. So let's talk a little bit about the practical use of a GitHub action. First, you have to start with an event trigger. There are 26 different events, as I said before, and they're as simple as you create a GitHub release, you open a pull request, you push code to the GitHub repository. All of these are in scope for how we would start. And it's no different than like how other downstream tasks in your workflows work today. Generally speaking, your CI/CD is going to happen when you push new code to GitHub or to whatever your source control system may be. Generally speaking, you're going to want to take some sort of notification flow when you push out a new release. These are all available here. Once you've taken or you've decided how you want to kick off your flow, you can go ahead and pick an action to take. In this case, this specific example is to test and publish a Node app to NPM. Right? So over on this right-hand side pane, for those of you viewing that direction, you're able to pull an action that is available, and all open source actions, all publicly available actions will be choosable in this pane. And then you can go ahead and set like little arguments for you. So in this case, we have one where you can set a test argument. All right, there it goes. So yeah, we're going to select this action. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the configuration for it, add a label for what this is going to do for us. The container for this action allows you to do a little bit more than just tests. So we want to make sure we do this specific function with that argument. We click Done here, and now we have a configured workflow that's going to go off of a push event, package up what we have in our repository, test it, and then publish it to NPM. And to look at what the workflow file really looks like, that was a visual editor that we released, but everything's backed by code, which I think personally, anything that's configured as code, that's versionable, that can be discussed in a pull request is easily the most powerful way to take care of any form of configuration item, and this is no different. So in this case, each action that goes into a workflow is defined here, and you can change those arguments and what action that we're going to source for it, what Docker file, really, we're going to source for it and where that lives. So you can see a couple of different ways we can get at this. It either belongs to a specific user, a specific GitHub user, so let's go out to their public repository, pull down that action file, and we're going to use that in our workflow. You can go out to Docker Hub, or you could just source it locally in your .github folder for the repo that you're in. To get an idea of what these Docker containers look like, it can be really simple. Like, this is really straightforward. It took us a couple of days to work through this pre-beta, but when we got to a point where we built this action, which is a release publish action, this was all the code that we wrote for the Docker file itself, and then we extended it with a small JavaScript file as well to work with SendGrid and pass a token along. So I'll talk a little bit about some use cases just to give you an idea of all of the things that could be possible here. We do like to joke that GitHub Actions can do everything or anything. However, it's not going to be very helpful to anyone without some use cases that you can maybe like glom onto a little bit. So myself and a few fellows that I work with at GitHub, we sat one afternoon and we're like, hey, we need to come up with a few ways to really explain useful cases that folks are going to understand so that they can then apply it to their own workflows. And a few of these were like this. On a repo public event, like we've open sourced a repository. We flipped it from private to public. Let's make sure that has a license file so it's not abused or misused in any way, shape, or form. That's a very specific GitHub action that you can write. It stays within the GitHub family where you check property that lives inside of github.com. And you also check for a license file that is generally of an agreed upon type. That's something that's very straightforward that I think a lot of folks run into, and we want to make sure that we do that. And if we don't like the result, if there's no license file, let's flip that bit back to private maybe. On a release event, package up release notes and send to a distribution list via SendGrid. That's the code from the Docker file that I showed you earlier. Pretty straightforward again. You create a release inside of your GitHub repository for your project. You have a location where you might contain release notes. Maybe you want to summarize every single issue that's been merged since the last time you created it, or every single issue that's been closed since the last time you created a release. Let's build that into a little package that goes through a JSON payload to SendGrid. SendGrid routes that to a distribution list of your choosing. On a member event, open up an onboarding guide and an issue form. This is something that we do internally at GitHub already. Anytime somebody is new to GitHub, a new hire, when they join a team, a specific team inside of GitHub, we'll create an issue that has a checklist of things that they should be reading, they should be checking out, get familiar with, watch these repos, star these repos, et cetera, right? We can do this automatically when a member joins that team, or repository in this case. And then there are some more well-traveled examples that are already available publicly. A number of our partners put together, or with our partner engineering team, put together these options, like sending messages and emails to Twilio and SendGrid, deploying to well-known cloud hosts like Google Cloud, AWS. There are several other options there. You can publish to NPM, as you saw from before. You can configure IoT buttons with Flick, kick off Terraform flows. There's a great example with HashiCorp coming out to show that at GitHub Universe last week. You can update Docker Hub containers after a release. Jesse Frizzell came and showed us how to do that. You can do phased deployments with LaunchDarkly. They built a GitHub action that helps us show that off. There are a lot of options available right now, and I'm going to go into a few more specifically just to kind of give you an idea. So just using GitHub's API, you could be new to a repo. You're opening up an issue. Maybe you're looking to contribute to an open source project for the first time. That project can have a GitHub action configured that's able to see an issue comment and look for specific words in that payload that can then trigger this bot to come back and say, like, hey, I can tell based on what you said, hello, I'm new here, that sort of thing. I'm going to go ahead and point you to some onboarding guide or contributing guidelines. How many folks are familiar with Probot? Got a few. One GitHubber. Probot is a project that was originated from a number of GitHubbers that wanted to do something like what has ultimately become Actions, but it was an open source utility that allows you to spin up a Node app with write some JavaScript to allow you to do some things with our platform and take some. Really, that last example is something very similar, and then this one's another one just like it. This specific flow here was a Probot app, right? And through the work of Brandon Keepers, we're now going to be able to take existing Probot apps and turn those into GitHub Actions. In this case, there's a Probot app that's able to detect if your issue has been created before, right? So like we're going to create a new GitHub issue. Perhaps you have hundreds of these open. We want to make sure through some sort of analysis that you're not just opening a duplicate issue. For open source maintainers, that's almost a day job in and of itself, just closing duplicate issues. For your private projects, it's probably the same thing. If you're working inside of your own business, you get hundreds of issues on certain projects. Some of them may be duplicates. Some of them may have better information than others. This specific flow via GitHub Action Form can help you trim down that list a little easier, maybe go so far as closing it automatically. Here's the cloud deployment example. I think this room is going to be pretty interested in this specific deal. So this is more of a, you could do all this, but maybe you shouldn't. You have the option to deploy to all of these different places, like Heroku, Google Cloud, AWS, Site. On push, we build a Docker image. We're going to take a look and make sure that this is a releasable branch. We could potentially go to each of these individual providers as to where we want to deploy. And really, you only have to assemble as many actions as you want from this flow. If you want to trim it down to just that right-hand side where we're just going to look at AWS, then by all means, you prefer that. One of the conversations that you can have now is maybe thinking about publishing or having the availability to publish to these other clouds, where if AWS is having some sort of availability challenge, you can go ahead and push out your code to somewhere else, and your global load balancer will take care of the rest. So we have that. That's just a build event there. So with GitHub Actions, we can have newer and more interesting conversations. And really, what I want to impress upon you before we leave here today is that even if you don't necessarily have a GitHub action you want to run or write immediately, what you should do is start talking to your teams about reasons you might want to work on it. And there are a bunch of conversations that we can have, and here's a few. CI systems are designed to do a lot of things well. Some things CI systems end up doing because you have nowhere else to put them. For me personally, when I was a Jenkins user very regularly at my previous employment, I made liberal use of that post-build steps area, right? It's just a big old text box. You can start dropping shell scripts in there that you want to have called after you're done with your job. You're going to use the same workspace, take advantage of all the same environment variables that you pass through. But like maybe you don't have to though, right? So like after you get done building and packaging your software, shipping it off for testing, bringing those results back, some of those other activities that you may be doing could be better built in a specific GitHub action and done more efficiently and on somebody else's runtime, namely ours. Preparing for the worst, where you may deploy to one specific cloud solution today, maybe you should be ready to deploy to another one tomorrow. Perhaps you want to spread your availability across a number of different cloud providers. Ultimately, to the end user, it won't look any different, right? The application is going to look and feel the same. But for you, in terms of maintaining your availability, you've spread your risk out to a number of different places. You can do this a lot simpler by just adding a GitHub action that deploys to your new area with your credentials that we encrypt and cache. This is probably the most important question I would ask. When we talked to when I spoke to the first customer that I did prior to releasing GitHub Actions, the first thing they said when we unveiled it was, wow, this is going to unblock me from a bunch of things that I've always wanted to do, but I've never really had the time to do it. They didn't have time to build a full-on app. Just hitting the API wasn't quite good enough. They needed to do a little bit more than that. And maybe now, with whatever language they're choosing, they're going to be able to build an action to take care of some of these problems. And the way that his eyes lit up when we unveiled this to him, and be like, imagine this in every customer that we talk to and every GitHub user that works with this. There's so many more things that y'all can come up with to do that we can't just think of, right? We came up with a bunch, and we worked with our partners to come up with a few more. But really, I'm more interested in what each of you can do, right? What will you think of, and what will you build when you have this in your hands? All I want for you to take away is that you can have conversations that you've never been able to have before and build these sorts of systems into places that you haven't had access to. And if you want to share some of that with us, we did say, and we're standing by the fact that if you want to skip the beta line, you can share some of these ideas with us with hashtag GitHub Actions. I think my favorite one from David Mittman, I mean, JPL comes on and says, like, hey, yeah, let's update a Mars rover with a GitHub action. And be like, all right, cool. It sounds good to me. And then some other practical cases around accessibility testing, right? Like one of the other things we played around with when we were working internally was like, why don't we just run like PMD and check style in a GitHub action, and we don't have to do that on CI anymore. We don't even have to think about it. We can run that right away, make those required status checks so that we can do, make sure style's good, make sure linters are good, that sort of thing. Just do that in an isolated environment. So given all of that, you can go ahead and register for the beta here. It's a pretty straightforward deal. There's a nice landing page for it when you go to that URL. It kind of helps explain a little more than just what a 30-minute talk can do. And once you get there, you'll be put in the queue, and then over time we will get to it. So we're working through people as fast as we can. We've already got a number of folks involved. As I said before, we're over the 32K sign-up mark, so no problem getting in line. We will get everybody eventually. But if you want to try some of this stuff out without having access to the beta yet, there are a few things that I learned along my way trying to work with actions. So I didn't even want to kick off one of these builds and just have it fail in front of me without me knowing that I could test this locally. Very classic way of going about it. So how we did it, we made liberal use of request bin. So every single time you kick off a GitHub event, that event has a payload associated with it. It's got all sorts of interesting information in there, JSON form. And you can send that to a request bin, take all that data, store it locally, perhaps customize that payload to a way that's going to help you with your testing. And then, if you don't already, pull down Docker. And then you can start working on a specific action inside of a Docker file in any language that you choose. Really, anything runnable is going to be fine here. This is, again, one of the bigger advantages over Probot specifically, where that's a JavaScript, a very specific JavaScript world. Like, if you know Java, if you know Ruby, if you know Shell, if you know PowerShell, it doesn't really matter anymore. You can build this in any language that you choose. From that point, there are actions that are out there right now that are publicly addressable, sitting on Docker Hub and GitHub. Folks like myself can help point you to them. One of the things that we still need to work on is like how easy is it to get at these sorts of things. When you're in the visual editor, which when you're in the beta, you'd be able to get at this, you can find actions very easily for right now. You kind of have to find them on your own. But you can get an understanding of how these things work practically by looking at examples that were ready on day one. And from there, if you haven't used Probot before and you are JavaScript inclined, that's a good place to start. It gives you a good idea of where this flow works, how it works practically for everyone, and some great examples in that project as well. So I'd encourage you to check that out. OK, so I did my best to make sure I left time for some questions. This is how you can reach me otherwise. But if anybody has anything they'd like to know, we've got a solid like 5 minutes or so, and I'll just go for it.
Any timeline around
OK, I'm glad you asked that. So the question was, is there any timeline for when this would be available in GitHub Enterprise? Are there a lot of GitHub Enterprise customers here? Just OK, almost everyone. Cool. So let's talk about that practically. Let's talk about that practically for a minute. The GitHub.com experience here is unique in a couple of ways. One, we're doing all of the runtime for you. So each of these Docker containers, each of these actions, they come into our infrastructure. We do that runtime. We queue up your action. We run it. We give you the results. And we go on, so on and so forth. In this beta program, we have a lot to learn about scaling out this architecture internally. And we've been spending the last 10 years working with up to 31 million developers, and a lot of them being members of businesses, to make sure that we have available, scalable infrastructure for what you do day in and day out. Same problem here. It's just we're building something new and we're using newer technologies to do it. Our experience with containers goes about a couple years deep right now, and scaling this out to everybody is going to take a little bit of time. So as we're learning, we're going to learn the lessons that you won't have to when GitHub Enterprise is available to support this. And a couple of things we've considered is maybe you could still use our runtime and you can reach out to github.com. Possible. We don't know if that's the way it'll go. Also, potentially, you could bring your own container infrastructure. Again, we're not sure, but when we learn the lessons that we will from the beta and building this out at scale, that'll allow us to answer those questions for you. So really, we've got some time to learn. And when we do have an accurate timeline that we can share, we absolutely will do so.
What about costs for private repos and things? Like you've already got like a business account on GitHub that comes with additional costs or resource limits?
Right, yeah, so the practical limits of the runtime right now, I think like we have like about an hour in the queue time and 5 minutes runtime, execution time, where we limit that down. So one great advantage of that is that the people that threaten to run Bitcoin mining rigs on our infrastructure will be sadly disappointed by their ability to do so. So at least we got that covered. But for folks that are on like business cloud and that sort of thing, what we're trying to figure out is like what is a reasonable way to cover our costs of hosting all this, right? For business cloud, obviously, y'all are paying a subscription service to use this in the first place. From that point on, though, like we aren't sure what's practical. Again, same thing with the beta program. We need to figure out what level of efficiency we can generate to get that cost for how we build that infrastructure out down to a minimum, and then we can go from there to figure out what makes sense practically. Public versus private repositories, that sort of thing, like what kind of default runtime limits you'll be getting. It's all up for discussion still. We're definitely looking at other people who do this for a living and seeing what their models look like so that nobody feels like shocked or like surprised by how that works. So yeah, more to come there as well. Any other questions?
I can have a question.
Sure, yeah.
So between Azure Functions, AWS Lambda, and GitHub Actions, which one do you choose?
Between Azure Functions, AWS Lambda, and GitHub Actions, which one do I choose and why? Well, if you're working on production stuff right now, I wouldn't use GitHub Actions for that yet, because we're still learning. So a couple of these systems have been out already, but like, I think what is most important to me is that on GitHub, like when you can put this close to your source code, you can version it there, you can use those events and those payloads to generate these workflows. I would absolutely choose GitHub Actions every time when that's ready to go for prime time. For these other systems like AWS Lambda, like they've been out there for a bit, and I think like a lot of folks had been trying to grasp like what would I use this for, and there hasn't been like a lot of genesis of like what starts the workflow. And when you think about like a Git push or a release event or a pull request comment as what starts that off, like I can definitely figure it out now that I have a triggering event, and I can wrap my head around that very quickly. For me, when I was at home trying to think of how I would use Lambda and how I'd practically show that off, like it took me a very long time to understand what was the right thing to do. So yeah, so just at Lambda and Azure, like same sort of deal there. For GitHub Actions, there's a clear event as a developer that I can wrap my head around, that I know that this is the right place to take this information. So that's how I feel on that one. OK, well, we're under a minute, so I'll probably just wrap it for now. If y'all want to talk any more about this, I'm around for a few more hours today for sure. So feel free to either come back to where we're sitting inside the boothing area, or we can talk for a little bit outside or something like that. No big deal. Thanks, y'all.